This is the first of two panel discussions. I'm Len Freedman again, and loosely, and we're going to keep it pretty loose, this session is going to focus on, for lack of a better term, and I've already met several people during the breaks who don't like this word, and I muffed it this morning, on the democratization of science. However you all want to define that. I think that there are I think opportunities here in terms of a lot of what you've heard today. My mind has certainly exploded in terms of some of the, or many of the initiatives that have been described here today. And I think it's an opportunity for the scientific community and beyond to take advantage of many or most of what you've heard today. But I think that there are different perspectives and even unintended consequences that perhaps we can discuss. And so I'd like each of you to introduce yourselves, and then once we do that, each panelist will have 5 minutes or so to give it their best shot. Then I will ask a few sort of questions to get you all going, and then we'll have a fairly extended Q&A from the audience. We have 1 hour, or we have 1 hour to do that. So with no further ado, Will?
All right, I'm Will Canine. Are we doing our answer first, or just? Just
introductions, okay. And then we'll.
Will Canine, co-founder of OpenTrons. We make robots for biologists. You saw Kristen earlier.
I'm Maureen Muldavin. I'm the president of Counterculture Labs, a DIY biology space in Oakland, California.
I'm Meagan Palmer. I'm a senior research scholar working at the Center for International Security and Cooperation at Stanford University.
I am Lenny Tadelman, a geneticist and computational biologist, and I'm still with protocols.io since the talk I gave.
My name's Manya Baker. I'm on the news and comment desk at Nature.
Okay, so let's start with Will.
So democratization of biology.
And beyond.
And beyond. Okay, so I'll just start by sort of telling my story. I guess maybe it would be a good place to start. So I'm not a trained biologist. I learned how to pipette at GenSpace, which is a biohacker space in Brooklyn. And places like GenSpace or Counterculture Labs, I think, are at the forefront of this idea of democratizing biotechnology. And to me, what does democratizing means? It means that more people, and therefore crucially more types of people, have access to a technology, to a capability, to a resource, whatever the thing is that's being democratized. And crucially, what comes with that, and I think what democratization means, is really empowerment. I think that it's when people not only then have access, but can use it to affect the world around them. And probably, that means they're in, a farm, or they're trying to cure a rare disease that affects their family, or they have a water pollution problem in their community, and today they don't know how to run the right assay. Right? And how do we get the tools in that person's hands so that democracy can flourish and people can live good lives, and they can really have access to the powerful tools that all of us in this room sort of take for granted. So I think that democratization is happening in a lot of ways. Some of it is from tools that are getting cheaper, that are getting easier to use. I mean, DNA sequencing and synthesis is a prime example of an exponential curve that's providing, a democratizing force. But really, it's people that are the main drivers of democratization. I think it's like the 350 people that gathered at MIT at Dave Kong's meeting a few weeks ago of the Global Community Bio Summit. It's all these people connecting and sharing their knowledge and their resources together. So that's mine.
So I'm Maureen Muldavin, and I run a biohacking space. So democratization of science, to me, it's about moving from the idea of science as kind of like top-down education. Scientists explain science to people It's where people can have full access to scientific knowledge. I think this is really important because there's this idea like of problem solving is that it's not just whether or not you are good at solving a particular problem. It's what problems are prioritized and what problems are believed to be important. And that's, I think, one of the fundamental issues with inequality is that you have people who are kind of shut out from having their problems heard and taken seriously and solved. So by having a biology lab that anyone can participate in and be part of, a lot of our projects in our lab that citizens are working on are really important to those individual people. We have a group of vegan activists that are making cheese without cows by genetically engineering yeast. Or we have a group of diabetics who are really concerned with the cost of insulin and how many people die from that in developing countries every year. So, what problems I think are important or what problems the scientists think are important are not necessarily the problems that everyone agrees are important. And by having everyone have access to science, then you can have a technological civilization that is equal to all people. But if you shut off scientific access to only being a small portion of the population, then you're setting up a system where it's kind of like you have a scientific priesthood. And I personally don't want a small segment of the population to be the only people who are able to understand or decide the nature of scientific knowledge. So.
Okay. I think I'll explain a little bit about my background, and then I'll just make a few comments on democratization. So I'm actually a biological engineer by background, and then I spent 5 years managing a multi-university research center in synthetic biology, in particular the policy-related research agenda within that. And now work with a number of organizations, including the iGEM Foundation, to help to really enable scientists and engineers to think about how they engage in sort of policy issues writ large. So that's my background. And I somehow stumbled into working for and within a Center for International Security, thinking about how do we develop this global community and policy issues in a global setting. And this issue of standards development has really been, I think, a central sticky issue of how do we actually develop standards, merely sets of rules, sets of agreements on what is desirable or undesirable. So I just wanted to touch on 3 different issues that I think have been part of this conversation but not really central to it. Those 3 issues that I think are important are, the first is politics and power. The second is misuse. And the third is design and practices. So in terms of politics and power, right, one of the things that we haven't really talked about centrally here is there are tons of different companies, right, and different players in this space that are developing platform technologies for openness, right, or use or reproducibility. But really this is about, whose standards is going to win, right? Who's going to win? Who's going to lose? It's not all openness, it's not all equity. There are really vested interests at play here. And so some of the people and who has the power to decide are not always evident. So I hope that we can discuss some of those issues. The second is on misuse. We talk about openness and access, but there are trade-offs of openness and access. What does it mean if all these tools and knowledge gets into the hands of people who may not have the same types of motivations and intentions as your intended customer base, right? So those are a lot of the conversations I participate in these days. And the third is on design and practices. The things that interest me are actually these types of processes. How do we actually decide how this balance between use and misuse, or efficiency and security, how do they actually get encoded in the practices of your companies or your organizations? So what are the types of things that we can discuss early on in terms of balancing those long-term use, misuse, politics, equity, those types of discussions early on? So when I think about democratization, democracy it's a political choice, right? And so how can we make more evident the types of political choices inherent in our practices?
So that's a lot of themes, and I don't know if I need to inject much else into this discussion, but the only thing that I will add when I think about democratization is we get very excited about new tools, and I get excited about them, and I think there is reason to be excited about them, but they don't necessarily translate to everyone now being able to do science. And there's one element in this entire discussion that's just been missing from this day. That's not our focus, but it's access to the knowledge, right? So when we think about open access, right, we forget about democratizing for citizen scientists and do-it-yourself enthusiasts. We haven't democratized science for scientists, right? If you're not at MIT or UCSF, you can be at a less well-funded institutions in the US, and a lot of the papers you need to read you don't have access to. Then you go to Global South, right? And of course, when you get out of academic institutions, how are you supposed to ask questions and use the cool things we're building if you can't read what's been done, right? So I think in addition to all of the tools, devices, and platforms, we have to keep that in mind, that that's part one of democratizing.
And I guess I'll just say, I think a big chunk of democratization would be research, putting out research that other scientists can build on. I mean, I think much of the concern about reproducibility occurred because a lot of people were speaking out that they were trying to build on exciting papers, and there wasn't a strong foundation. So I think research that other people can build on is really important.
I don't think your mic is on, but
Oh dear.
Just hand it out.
Or maybe my hair was blocking it. Can people hear me? Okay. Better?
Yes.
I think a really important part is to have research that other scientists can build on.
okay, so you guys are going to make me work, it sounds like, because you were very efficient. So I'm going to touch on a few of the points that you all brought up, and then again, I'd really like, you've heard enough of me today, I'd like to really hear from the audience. But Maureen, you referred to the high priest of, or the scientific priesthood, if you will. I think I'm pretty sure I know what you're referring to, but why don't you expand on that idea?
I guess that's kind of
And also, here's my second question, sorry. How did you get engaged in this whole space? I'm just kind of curious. How did you found this community group? And
Okay, so I guess scientific priesthood is a somewhat contentious term, but I guess what I mean by that is in order to participate and understand science, you need to be able to get into and attend a research university, essentially, and because all the papers are paywalled, and because scientific books are so expensive, and this conference is actually pretty cheap, but like Symbiotic Bio is, I think it was $1,700. I was up for a free ticket. Then there's very limited ability for the majority of the population to engage with science, except by being kind of told by scientists, how it is. And if you kind of read the news, like it's kind of like scientists say this or scientists say that, and that really means that I talk to people all the time. Like I've talked to chefs recently who really want to be able to scientifically test the grains they're using to see how nutrient dense they are. But that kind of like use case, since they're so separated from science, they can't really go talk to a scientist and kind of say, hey, food scientists, the chefs want you to do this. So it's kind of like a top-down kind of communication, which I think is really negative because people do this thing where they're kind of like, I believe in science, like I believe in climate change, or I don't believe, and it's just science isn't a matter of like belief.
by the way, I just want to point out to you that you're in one of the temples of the scientific priesthood here at UCSF. So, in William Rudder Hall, one of the high priests. How did you come to this point in terms of your activism and founding this community?
I kind of fell into it. I started off by, I don't work in science. And so, but I studied biochemistry in school, and I've always loved science, like my whole life. So I kind of fell into this strange group of people, and they were going to start up this new project. So I helped co-found the Open Insulin Project, which is creating open source insulin. And that just kind of really made me think a lot because 300 million people around the world have diabetes, and insulin's been off patent for decades now. And then it was also been a human medication since the 1920s, so it's not a generic version. So I started thinking about what work is funded and work becomes important. It started becoming, it started being something I thought a lot about. And so then I kind of became, after about 6 months, I started running Counterculture Labs as an organization, and I became the president of it in January.
So Will, do you think that your OpenTrons liquid handler can quote unquote democratize science so that even community activists can test the latest IPA that they buy for what the content is of their beer?
Yeah, I think that we can definitely hit a part of it. So OpenTrons, right, we're 10 to 100 times cheaper than any other lab automation out there. So that's a democratizing force, right? It increases access. But I think that the even more interesting one is de-skilling a lot of this stuff. So that rather than, that was my frustration in GenSpace was I had to become an artisan with a micropipette in order to realize my experiments. And I'm like, why can't I download this protocol and hit run on my 3D printer? Why doesn't that exist? And I think that level of, abstracting away a lot of the execution of these basic protocols is also a huge democratizing force that I think we're already, we're seeing people use our machines in sewer, contamination testing facilities who, they're not lab techs, they're not trained biologists. Now they can run this assay because they have to hit a couple buttons on a robot. So yeah, I guess that's, yes, we hope we can. But I also wanted to circle back to Meagan's question about politics and thinking about who, democratizing for whom is always a big part of the question. And so who are the intended user bases, but then also who are the people behind that? We have, we're a venture-backed company whose mission is to democratize science. So obviously there are multiple interests at play there. And I do think it's really important to be open about all that stuff. So I don't know, I think it's an interesting question and certainly at the heart of this issue. I hope I'd love to answer any questions that you have about it.
So Meagan, you brought up a bunch of points, and I'd love to hear you expand on any of them. The first one you brought up is what Will just alluded to, which is kind of the quote unquote politics and power. And that ultimately somebody's going to win out here. And the example that we've used in the past, we being my organization, actually in this PLOS Biology paper, this economic analysis, is the World Wide Web, where that was. I wasn't there for it, but that was apparently a very open, very collegial, very collaborative initiative, and everybody agreed on sort of going into it, what the quote unquote standards would be, and the result was the internet. Founded by Al Gore. But how do you see, could you use that example or another example and apply it to, what we've been talking about here? Or ultimately, is it going to be Betamax versus VHS, and VHS is going to win?
I think we're still, in some ways, struggling to find the right analogies on how to grapple with these issues. And they're not issues that are going to go away, right? They're sort of fundamental issues of equity and access. I think we're looking a lot now at sort of platform technologies, right? And thinking about who owns the platform, right? We're supposedly giving many more people, right, the tools of I think you said empowerment, right? But what does that actually mean in terms of who actually has a stake in the platform itself? And so, even looking at something like Uber, right? Uber is an example of, many more people are tapped into it, but what are the interests behind it? And so I think some of the way we have to safeguard against this is really, like you said, talking about what are the various interests that are at play, and sometimes, conflicting, and what are the trade-offs that we're making along the way. Even the web is one example where, early intentions around having sort of access and use, at some stage there were decisions to have commercial interests be part of those activities, and that really fundamentally reshaped those activities. You can say it was critical to its growth, but then there's also, debates around, how access to information occurs over time. So I think my biggest interest is in making sure that we critically examine those issues, and when we say something like open or access or democracy, that we really get down to those base assumptions, right? We put our scientist hat again and say, like, what are the parameters of that? How would we know if this was open? How would we know if this was useful or reproducible? And that's the same thing when it comes to issues of misuse, for instance. I bring that up. It was not something that I necessarily even thought about when I was developing technologies as sort of what could go wrong. And there's been a lot of imaginations around also enabling technologies that can be misused, 3D printers again. We don't always see those things happen in the world, right? So we have to subject them to a lot of analysis. But it's worth thinking through the problem of, if we're opening up these technologies, does that get us more security or less security? And again, how would we know? So those are the types of questions that I spend my day thinking about.
There's some questions, so let's take them.
I would like to comment this directly.
Microphone.
So I would like to comment this directly, because I think it's a really interesting point. I think you touched on two elements. First is like the open data. So my question is, first of all, if we're when I'm talking strictly about, let's say, academic data here, so it's very clear that this data belongs to the people who ultimately finance research, right? So the first question is, like, how do you see the data being shared all around the world versus, to a specific country or government that finances that? And second of all, like, the other thing that you mentioned is sort of, if I understood correctly, it's more like the potential threats that might arise from having this data available. Like, I don't know, just to think of an example from the top of my head, like, I don't know, if you see that this virus is very lethal for a person, then somebody can potentially use this data and generate this virus with the evil, let's say, intentions. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, I'll maybe comment on that second issue, and then I'm sure, Ammonia, for instance, you have around sort of data access and academic knowledge. You could probably comment on that. I don't know, up to you. But on the second issue, the issue of sort of open access to information, potentially risky or dangerous information of the life sciences, has been a topic now for about, or quite an active topic for about 16, 17 years, when there were early debates around whether or not there were experiments that might pose unjustifiable risks. And now this is encoded in policy in the US, elsewhere, as dual-use research of concern policy. But it was an active debate on whether or not certain research should be restricted. And eventually it was decided that it should be not restricted, or restricted in certain ways, but rather there were maybe some experiments that should never be done. And so, I think that we're stumbling forward in this debate. But some of the ways that this manifests for you guys here is, say there's a topic now on we restrict through export control, right? Information, materials, and equipment, right? Equipment that you develop. So there's a big debate of, should any of the equipment that's designed to ensure reproducibility be restricted through export controls, right? So that's the type of decision that policy discussion that you guys would need to be engaged in. And generally, it's thought like you shouldn't restrict this stuff, but maybe you want to monitor it. What does that mean? Do any of you guys want to comment on the sort of access to information?
I guess I'd like to comment on it. That I think access to information is a really interesting topic because you start kind of saying, I believe that people need IP and need to be able to hold on to some of their own data, especially if they're having like commercial use. But then you also have to kind of ask, what responsibility you have as a researcher to kind of share data. And my personal belief is if you're actually going to publish a paper, I think that you need to make your data that went into the publishing of that paper available, because otherwise there's really no way to really achieve these reproducibility goals. And I think that you kind of, if reproducibility is something that is valued, people need to start being able and willing to share their data more widely, or it just won't be possible.
So an additional comment on this topic, I actually chaired a panel at the FISCI, which is the Force 11 Summer Institute, and one of our speakers was an MD from Ghana. And basically he said, look, it should not be, right? It should not be that the only way that we control and figure out what an infection is and how it spreads is to call in experts from Europe and have them fly in. That's ridiculous, right? So what they need on the ground, they have the people. They need cheap machines as much as possible. The lower energy use, the better, right? And then they need access to how the protocol was done exactly, right? Because they can go in and within a matter of maybe a couple of days actually try to figure out, hey, this is what's spreading in my community. But they can't read the papers, which is ridiculous in some cases. So I know a lot of the Zika papers were open access just for that reason. And a lot of the others, so the publishers have stepped up in very specific cases, and it's been great. But the also, having the cheaper machines out there is really important because they shouldn't have to fly samples to the UK in order to answer a question from Ghana or Zimbabwe or wherever. They have the people. They just need access to the protocols, in essence.
And just a quick comment on that. I think that's a perfect example of the broader framing of something like security, right? Where access to tools, information, knowledge that can be locally deployed and developed is like critical to, right, ensuring these problems. And so that's, when I pose these questions about misuse or security, it's partially to raise the question, but often it's folks that don't have the broader framing of how access, and tools and people at the end of the day contribute to solving problems.
There's a comment in the back.
So two questions. Just building exactly off of that, I'm so glad that you brought that up because, again, many of us have been in these kind of DoD or security circles, and so there's that question of like how do we prevent the bad guys from getting stuff? And then it's sort of like, again, my answer oftentimes is the same. Well, don't we want more good guys, quote unquote, to have tools specifically for these reasons, right? If you've got kind of different parts of the globe where infectious disease is spreading, don't we want more people literate in bio that know how to work these tools and so on? So the first question is, are there kind of frameworks or guidelines or sort of principles that are emerging as this technology continues to spread out that we can kind of balance the quote-unquote good guy, bad guy effect and ensure that the technology is being used for quote-unquote good purposes relative to both safety and security, which are different issues, right? Accidental things happening and then rogue actors, right? So that's the first question. The second question is, again, for Will and Maureen and for everyone, but one of the things that I think is super exciting about DIY bio, biohacking, and kind of the non-institutional bio is the emergence of new technologies that you wouldn't see given the institutional constraints of academia, government, and corporations. I don't think it's a surprise that you're seeing, personal liquid handling machines, tabletop DNA analysis, and all that stuff coming from, basically the DIY community as opposed to academia, right? So my question is for the panel is are there areas of innovation that you see that are coming out that are kind of vistas and things that we could point to look forward to in the future?
Well, I'll take a stab at all that. Yeah, when I get asked sort of the security question of what happens when more people who don't want good things to happen get access to this, I try to do a thought experiment, which is, let's imagine that a technology that could feed the world, produce every material thing that we want, and cure every disease was instead used to pop out boner pills, make poisonous farms, pollute the environment and all of our streams, right? And that's actually the world that we live in. So I think that there's a lot of room for the good guys to make up ground before we start. So I think that's kind of, it's a crazy thing to say, but think about it. And I think that the point that just getting the protocol and the hardware in the people's hands that need it, that's so much of what needs to happen. And the people that get that and that are used to not having the tools that they need, but now suddenly, because of open source hardware, Arduinos, Raspberry Pis, 3D printers, open source libraries of software, now they actually can produce this stuff. I think that that's the environment where enabling technologies come from, and not just new technologies, but democratized technologies, because OpenTrons isn't doing anything that's technologically revolutionary. We're taking a pipetter and a 3D printer and we're putting it together in an easy-to-use system that's affordable, right? And that's the democratization step, not the high-tech innovation step. And I think that that's another thing that you see in these garage spaces, the biohacker spaces, the community labs. So, I mean, and just to circle back to this, this is actually a thing that we have tried to do. We put together a USAID grant proposal for under $10,000, 2 robots, runs on a car battery, and has a qPCR at the end. You can use the CDC's Zika screen and run screens live, and it didn't get funded. Instead, a bunch of better mosquito nets got funded, right? I think that there's sort of an amount of risk that a lot of the agencies haven't been willing to accept. I'm new to all that stuff, and I definitely have a lot to learn there, but I would just say that in terms of the markets that we've been trying to serve, that one's a challenging one, and I'm looking for really good ways of making it happen.
Can I follow up? Yeah. Actually, I talked too much. Why don't you go?
I just wanted to follow up on the safety and security a little bit, because that's a question I get asked all the time. The question is, people think, it's either kind of academic research, why is academia safe? Is academia especially differently regulated? Academia is in universities, and the universities have safety regulations and AHR departments, which make sure that people don't blow up the world in academic labs. Community labs also have the same thing. It's not really that if people who aren't, trained scientists start doing biology in a community lab, it's not really a free-for-all. There's a whole community of people. We screen chemicals that come into our lab, and we have projects people go through a safety committee. Every single community lab I know, and I know there's hundreds around the world now, do the same thing. So I think that, if you're talking about if the average everyday person starts doing more scientific research, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not going to be an emphasis on safety. It really depends how the community develops. Yeah, that's the only thing I wanted to add.
I just wanted to jump in and say that, if we're thinking about the democratization of science, one pressure point is to go to the governments that fund science. I mean, I know the Netherlands and I think the UK have both sort of put out broad questions to the open public. What should we fund? What questions are you interested in? And I would imagine that the reason that you have people from the UK flying over to Ghana is because it's easier for the Wellcome Trust to give UK researchers the money than to send it over to Ghana. And I think we have somebody from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation on the next panel, and I'd love to hear from them.
Maybe, you want to say something?
Go ahead. I'll reserve it later. Please.
No, I was just going to say there's a big question on all of this is like what else needs to get democratized at the same time as we're, democratizing information or knowledge, and maybe that's, how do we think about democratizing regulatory processes, right? So that those processes are more democratic, or democratizing, access to expertise needed to, develop local capacities. One thing I think about on the topic of this is like I think that, biosafety has like a reproducibility crisis, right? So like we're really bad at accounting for all the ways in which we fail in the lab in reproducible ways that can design better systems. We actually don't account or capture that information. So there's other ways to take a spin on this.
The comment that I wanted to make is in all of this discussion, when we think about citizen science, we're, in the particular panel itself and more broadly, we're, I think, over-focused on will it be applied for good or for bad? What are the discoveries that are going to come out? But in my mind, the biggest promise and potential of citizen science isn't in the discoveries that will be made. I think most of the discoveries will still be made by trained scientists who know how to do science and who know what the next question is and have spent the last 6 years reading all of the literature to figure out what they should do next. I think the biggest potential with things like Bento, right, it's in getting people connected to science, engaging them with science. So EPA, for example, a year ago, commissioned a report on citizen science from the Council of Advisors, and they said that citizen science is like possibly the most important thing that EPA should be focused on for engaging the public, right? And it goes far beyond what the application is and what we're monitoring and what will be discovered, but things like Foldscope from Manu Prakash, so I'm friends with him, he's a professor in Stanford who has a $1 microscope. It's not, sure, it can be when he gives a talk on this, he'll talk about what you can do with pathogen analysis, right, or blood samples. But if you really chat with him, the bigger thing that's driving him isn't a discovery or the application of the Foldscope, it's putting it into the hands of kids, right? 1 million microscopes that are $1 each and giving them away throughout the world so that you connect people to what is science, right? And get more people excited. And both left and right, conservative and Republican, we're equally wonderful at ignoring science and not believing it. So the more people you can connect and engage, the better policies, the better vaccination rates, right? The better support for climate change. And that, I think, is the real power of citizen science, at least in the next 20 years, in my mind, what it can really do.
Good point, Lenny. I'll take off from where you just stopped. So for the people, by the people, and of the people, right? And reproducibility crisis, I think, stems from certain behavior patterns, wanting to contribute the information of how they did their experiments, not caring enough to not share the information, or simply not knowing what to share. So the flip side is the part of ethical science. What is the ethics behind it? How do I know what is ethical and what is not ethical? So that is also so with institutional and community citizen scientists, what about the portion of how to do proper science? How do I report proper science? And not knowing how to do it is, I think, a major contributor to this crisis. So how do we address that? How do we tell trainees how to do it, or citizen scientists in this case?
Maybe it would be worth commenting on this topic with regards to some of the activities and work we've been trying to do with the International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition. How many of you guys are familiar with iGEM? Who's not familiar with iGEM? So a few people. So like quick 2-second sort of summary of it is, the first robotics competition, you get a kit of parts, you build a machine, that machine plays a game against another machine. I did this in high school because I'm Canadian. We had to build a robot that played hockey. It's like necessary. But it's the same thing with genetically encoded parts. And then students put them together over the course of a summer, and they will then share their results at the end of the summer and compete for the most useful product. Now, they don't have bugs that compete against each other, but rather the most useful design. But one of the things we've been trying to experiment within that is how do you actually encourage or cultivate practices that are really sort of responsible social and scientific practices. And part of my research actually studies how do those norms and practices develop over time. And we've been running this experiment for 13 years. This year we'll have 310 teams from 44 countries participating and thousands of students. And I think that one of the things that I've anecdotally seen, although would like to see it a lot more, be interested in what you guys think, is that a lot of this comes down to who are your role models within your institution? Who are the leaders that you develop? Who are the people who you think are cool, like Manu, right? That set the example and create that example, and then create processes that reinforce the incentives and the institutional structures. And so I think a lot of it lies in this, is having people who you admire who prioritize sharing. Who ask critical questions about whether or not something is just or equitable or access. And so I'd like to see more emphasis on that leadership development of the people who don't just espouse but demonstrate those practices.
Practice and preach. My last question is for all the journals or publishers in the room. If we cannot drive without license and registration, how can we publish without giving catalog numbers, lot numbers, immunogen sequence, and such things like that? And I know this is a debate, a big question, but what will it take to get enforced in the community? You need to provide, all the information, and we know a huge list of it, if you want to publish. Because in my mind, publishers are the police, like the policemen, right? The policing agency in the scientific community, and providing all the information, which has been repeated quite many times here today, will help in reproducing science. So what will it take to get enforced?
You're in the news part.
Yeah,
So.
This is actually not a news, it's a community question.
But I mean, I'll say one thing. I mean, I feel I'm not on the manuscript side, so I don't have to work with this. But I feel like, there's a lot of the journals need to step up and whip you scientists into shape. And then if the journalists change their policy, it's like, you're making us do stuff. So, you got to pick one or the other. And if you pay a subscription, you're evil. And if you charge author fees, you're evil. So, you got to somehow, you have to pick what's going to work best. I mean, do you want, if you want the journalist to go through if you want a journal editor to go through your manuscript line by line, then, what kind of author fees are you willing to pay? And are you willing to do that yourself? And I mean, I don't think that everything, I don't think you can put everything on the journals. Now, I think the journals bear a lot of responsibility, but I don't think they can I don't think they have these superpowers that a lot of people think journals do have.
True, it's an intersection of the user, which is the researcher, the funding agency, and the publisher. My question was not just from the publishers, but what will it take in the scientific community for things to get enforced that we are talking about here?
Enforced is a bad word. We don't like to use that word here.
We have a tendency to point fingers like, funders don't care, they need to do this, or journals are sloppy and the editors need to catch mistakes. But peer review cannot catch mistakes, right? It can catch some of them, but it cannot certify a paper as being correct. Only time can tell, and other people independently reproducing it. It's not about NIH needs to solve it, right, or Howard Hughes or a particular journal. Journals are doing things, not all of them, but some of it is up to us scientists, right? So I'm pushing for organizing reproducibility workshops at conferences, right? Not run by us, but I think eLife will be starting that. So I've been pitching that idea to conferences, and I think eLife is going to be putting money into this. We can do this low-hanging fruit without enforcement, without policing, without pointing to blame, right? And if you think about Dryad that we just heard about and Figshare, 10 years ago, we didn't have these repositories, and this wasn't something journals were doing, right? Journals weren't connecting to protocols.io or RRID, so they're doing a lot. They cannot solve this. No one entity is in the position to just solve reproducibility issue. But I don't know, like we've never measured reproducibility 40 years ago. I have no idea if we're worse or better than we used to be. I see no evidence of crisis. I see increased visibility of a problem that we have. And we can do a lot better, but I challenge anyone to point me to data showing that we're worse today than 20 years ago in terms of how reproducible our published science is.
And I find the scientific societies are really encouraging. I mean, like neuroscience has its own workshop now. The American Society of Cell Biology keeps doing white papers. I mean, and I think that's, I feel like the norms that allow science to be rigorous really vary field by field. And so the scientific societies have a lot of influence in terms of getting more robust science. And I think that also falls into somebody was asking about citizen science. I don't know how many of you guys went to watch the eclipse or saw all the NASA.
Their apps.
Yeah, the NASA apps, they were really modeling some good, okay, we want to make sure that it's right, and we're going to, the ones that I heard, they were really talking about how they were going to check one against the other and sort of showing how to make things, yeah.
It's interesting in all this discussion about, especially as it relates to openness and transparency, but also just in terms of some of the things we've heard today, we haven't really talked about the role of the academic institutions themselves. Talked about the journals, we talked about funders. David Kong, I think in the back, pointed out that a lot of the really cool things that have been described today have come out of, startup labs, like many, startup companies that many of you are directly engaged in. I personally think that we have, the academic institutions have really been let off the hook on a lot of what we're talking about today as it relates to reproducibility, as it relates to the democratization of science, as it relates to even quote unquote enforcing some of the ideas around openness and transparency. And I think personally, and I've written about this, that a lot of it has to do with the quote unquote perverse incentives that are still very, very much in place and established as it relates to promotion, tenure, et cetera, in mainstream academic science. And I say this in the hallowed halls of UCSF, where, by the way, I did my postdoc many, many years ago, so I can say it.
I actually totally agree with that, Len, and I think it's a great point, so thanks for bringing it up. Just want to go back to the earlier conversation, which I actually thought was terrific. And the reason that I thought it was terrific is because it highlights, I think, what is at the essence of this issue. This is not an either-or problem. It's an and both. And where do we draw the line? So how many of the key constituencies contribute solutions to this problem, right? It's everyone, and everyone has a role in this. Meagan, the issue or the example you gave of iGEM is a terrific one, because that more than anything shows how it's and both. So it's a democratization of science, because you've got 5,000 students from 44 countries doing this incredible science in teams and then coming to show their results. But you also have an entire policy committee that's reviewing their work and identifying where the security issues are and where the, where intervention has to happen in order to keep a process like this safe. And so it seems to me that just in constructing that process, you've actually created a place where we can see what democratization of science looks like with safety engaged.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good example with the iGEM competition. One of the aspects of it is we do cultivate this community that essentially starts off in their first scientific engineering research experience with the idea that what you do is you give away what you make. And you give away your ideas get better. We get better by sharing and exchanging. And also on the policy side, it's been a test bed to find out where are there gaps in policy. And importantly, we don't say this is what you must do X, Y, Z in order to comply. Rather, it's actually develop an innovative way to expose the gaps and show us how we can do better. And we give a prize. The problem is that with an undergraduate or high school student, if I give them a T-shirt, right, they're gonna do it, right? And they're gonna get to show off their results. But when you become an adult, you start to see these perverse incentives in the institutions that you participate within. And often that spirit that you're trained within, it survives and it lasts, and you create the institutions around it. You try and adopt those principles, but you really do need these institutional entrepreneurs, right, that are willing to identify those problems and work on them and build the solutions and encourage, the response, the reproducibility conferences within it. And so, at the end of the day, it comes down to people being champions for these ideas throughout their career and despite perverse incentives.
So can I add to that or have some extra questions? So hi, I'm Anita, and I'm a UC entrepreneur. And that was how my little winning speech apparently started. But I think that really one of the things that we've learned over the last few years, really working on this and working with publishers really don't like this idea that they have a big stick, because it just seems like a really ridiculous thing for them to actually be seen as. They are a part of this community, as are institutions, as are funders, as are others. And while funders have really stepped up, NIH has a whole big webpage. Every time they talk, they say reproducibility, rigor. They're banging this drum, and in fact. The publishers, many of them have really stepped up. They've really started. Others have, done voluntary things, which have been possibly more successful than the ones that are actually required in all of this. And so we see different members of the community. The societies need to step forward, and many of them have. But one of the things that we still haven't seen a huge amount of is the institutions actually coming forward. And one of the things that I would love to be able to hopefully say at this time next year, because we're working with some folks over at UCOP, is to say, hey, here's an institution, we're in the hallowed halls of it here, that actually has done something, and it's done something because there's mechanism. And if there's a mechanism that enables the institutions to be able to track and measure something else, they will do it. So if we can provide them a mechanism, it actually will allow the institutions to provide this as a part of their tenure and review and change some of their, perverse practices and all these other things, because they have the mechanism to be able to get there. So I just would like to get a plug for ORCID. And adding extra things to ORCID is now possible. So if you have created a mouse or if you've created an antibody, I think by sometime next year, we should be able to give you academic credit for that via your ORCID account or software tools which are available now. So,
any other questions or comments? Go ahehed.
Just one more, my 2 cents to this discussion, which I think is really interesting. I think a lot of what we discussed, I agree, it's ridiculous to think of publishers really being the police, because publishing is one thing you can do as a scientist. I think ultimately, all of this, what we discussed, will help, but I think ultimately it comes down to the scientific integrity, what is who do I as a scientist want to be? How do I want to be perceived in the community? We all said, it's a communal thing. So I think one thing that sort of is a question for you guys, and I think it's I'm personally very surprised not to see that in science, is everywhere else where there is a community of people and there is software and Internet of Things and so on, you have this model Uber, Airbnb. If you're a good driver, the community will eventually realize that, and everybody else will see that. If you're a good host, the same. Or, you know, if you're a good passenger, if you're a good guest at somebody's house, there's a way how to rate these people. There's a way to rate the behavior, and there are systems how to improve the behavior. So to translate this to science, why isn't there a mechanism that I can go in and say, this article is not clear to me, I need to have, let's say, RRID references in here because I want to, you know, see this and that, and you know, there should be a discussion about this, or the person should be able to go back and add this. So you know, what I'm trying to say is there is no platform to directly discuss the invention, the research that was done, or am I missing this kind of platform?
I think the most. I mean, there's PubPeer, you could comment on PubMed, but I think the most common thing that
you can't comment, not anybody can comment on PubMed.
You have to register. You have to register.
No, you have to be a scientist.
But I think the most common thing that happens within the scientific community to get that insight is gossip at conferences. I mean, right? I mean, if you're within a community, you sort of know.
But that's not a systematic way. I'm talking about a systematic way.
I guess
There is.
Yeah.
I have something to add about that. I was talking about this earlier with some other people at the conference. I think scientific research on really difficult problems is a little bit different than other kinds of work. You know, like if I'm trying to decide, you know, what makes you a really good driver. What makes you a really good driver is, like, you know, you're really consistent. You know, you follow the rules of the road. You know, you show up on time. You have a clean car. What makes someone a good scientific researcher long term is that they, you know, discover something that's interesting and useful and changes the way that people think about something on a broader scale over a longer period of time. And that can be really difficult to point to and understand when it's when someone's still developing something. So, you know, I think it's good for people to have reproducible research. Because not reproducible, it's not very good. But kind of, you know, demanding that you know, all the money should go to the person who's best at like follow the rules of annotating their paper correctly. Where a lot of people are just really weird. There's a lot of really weird people currently throughout history who are not good at that kind of stuff and who honestly struggle in a lot of ways, who really have an interesting perspective, and I would hate for come up with a rating system and make people like that not be able to function.
Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to get to with gossip was, like, sometimes you just have to talk to people to figure it out.
But I think also we're seeing all these platforms that are trying to do this, that are trying to put a system on how good is this protocol, that is trying to make a mechanism for doing that. And I think that, you know, everybody in this room should ask themselves what they want that system to look like, because to Meagan's point earlier, like, each one of these different systems has inherent biases in them and inherent things that work for and against different groups. So, you know, do you want a computer algorithm deciding what is the best research, or do you want people commenting, right? Like, who do you all want this system to be, right? And what do you want it to look like? And vote with your feet, vote with your dollars, vote with how you use things, adopt the technology that aligns with your core beliefs. Because now is when these things are starting to consolidate, and you all are the ones that are going to decide.
There is, to follow up on all of this and what Monya said, scientists do talk by email, they talk at conferences. The problem is, even not just outside of academia when it comes to citizen scientists, the problem is if you're not at that conference, you don't know that paper doesn't work, right? The professor knows, another professor who was there knows, they talk, it's gossip. You don't know, right? So you can waste a year or two of your life because you weren't there. The issue, though, is there's a big difference between Uber, Lyft, Airbnb, and science. You know, for ride sharing, there's Uber and Lyft. For lodging, there's Airbnb. We have 27,000 journals. I don't think there will be the platform. Public Library of Science back in 2002, 2003 or 4 rolled out commenting on all of their articles. No one is using it, right? People talk on Twitter, people talk on ResearchGate. I think what we need to realize is because of the fragmentation, because of the number of platforms, what we need to focus on is not steering everyone into the place, right? We have a lot of conversations that are happening on protocols.io. The challenge is, if they're happening on a protocol that corresponds to a paper, you want to pull it in so that people reading the paper or looking at it on PubMed Commons, right, wherever you are, we want to integrate. You need to talk to Crossref. It will be really about federated solutions and pooling the information through Mendeley and citation management software to the right people, right, and trying to expose these conversations. We have the platforms, Twitter, ResearchGate, PubPeer, PubMed Commons, journal websites, but how do you integrate it? How do you make those conversations visible? That's the challenge, and it's unique, I think, in some way to our space because of the many places where we have these conversations.
Yeah, and I'm going to have the last word here because I want to stay on time. I think until there is this fragmentation, and I come back to what I said before, until there's incentives and rewards for people who are doing the right thing, and even venues. And I know F1000 is introduced this to publish replication-oriented papers. There just isn't the proper incentive, at least in academic research, to do that. And so you're going to have to rely on what you pick up at meetings or what you hear, from your buddy, down the hall. And that's not a great system. So I think that there have to be some fundamental changes on how we ultimately reward people. And with that, I think that we should stop because we want to stay on time because there are cocktails. So thanks for the panel and thanks to the audience.